We will get started now, and hopefully I don't kill myself as I walk behind this. Good afternoon, and we're going back a long time. We're going back 120 years. And you might say, well, it doesn't really matter what happened 120 years ago because we're living in 2024 now. But a lot of the seeds for your lives, or your parents or grandparents, maybe even your great-grandparents' lives, in my case it would be my grandfather and grandmother, all four of them happened around this time. 1905, the Niagara movement preceded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Lynching was a way of life in the United States. In fact, there were big events, lynching events. Theodore Roosevelt begins his second term, his first full term. People are leaving the farm for the city. Why? Because there's electricity in the city. There might be indoor plumbing in the city, and there might be jobs in the city, and people are leaving the farm. Child labor was a major problem in 1905, and that's a bunch of coal miners. They were no more than 8, 9 years old. There was a war between Russia and Japan, and 119 years ago, there are still problems between Russia and Japan. There was a Russian Revolution, and that's Georgy Kaplan, who is part of that. Football is a deadly game. How many of you watch either college football or the National Football League on the weekends? Anybody here? Well, this isn't a group for that, except you might have been interested in 1905 because of this. 18 on football death row in the season of 1905. 10 high school players died as a result of hurts on the gridiron. And that was a major problem back in 1905.
They died because of what?
They got injured playing football.
Oh.
Playing football. There's a betting scandal in baseball involving John J. McGraw, who did something very similar to what Pete Rose did. And Pete Rose died last week. And so Pete wasn't the first guy who ever bet on his own team. The movies. You want to go to a movie? It's 5 cents. And you could go to a movie in Pittsburgh. You could go to a movie in the Philadelphia area. The movies are there. How many of you read Sherlock Holmes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Comes back in 1905. Viva Las Vegas! It's a fake Elvis with my wife. 1905, Las Vegas becomes a city. It is the founding of Las Vegas, which looked nothing like it looks today. I'm going to start with the Niagara movement, W.E.B. Du Bois. And like I said, lynching was a way of life, and there was no equality between African Americans and whites at that time. And black intellectuals are saying, hey, wait a minute, what is going on? Why are we second-class citizens? And this guy, W.E.B. Du Bois, decides he is going to call together the leading intellects, African-American intellects of the time, see what they could do to change American society. 40 years after the South's defeat of the Civil War, the outlook for full civil rights for African Americans was bleak. America was clinging to its racist past, according to black intellectuals. It didn't seem that the president, William McKinley, from 1896 to 1901, or Theodore Roosevelt from 1901 through this part, 1905, was too concerned with racial relations. Reconstruction had failed by the mid-1970s, and Jim Crow laws were enacted in the South. The Supreme Court of the United States, 1896, separate but equal doctrine, Plessy versus Ferguson, coupled with Booker T. Washington's accommodationist policies, threatened to cloud any hope for full and equal rights under American law. And that is Booker T. Washington, and Booker T. Washington actually did meet with Theodore Roosevelt back in 1901, but here he is, and he was one of the leading African-American intellectuals at that point. He was also one of the most influential black leaders, and he argued that black people should advance themselves through learning skills such as farming and carpentry, rather than look to legal and political means to advance as a group. As you might expect, that was not winning him too many friends in the black intellectual movement. We shall not agitate for political or social equality, Washington declared in 1895 in a speech known as the Atlanta Compromise. Living separately yet working together, both races will determine the future of our beloved South. Plessy versus Ferguson was a landmark 1896 United States Supreme Court decision that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. Case stemmed from an 1892 incident in which an African-American train passenger, Homer Plessy, refused to sit in a car for black people. Does that sound like Rosa Parks? Does that sound like Irene Morgan back in 1944? See, you know Rosa Parks because of the Montgomery boycott. But how many of you know Homer Plessy? Not many of you. And this is the Plessy versus Ferguson plaque, but there are no known pictures of him. This is the best I could do. White and black Southerners mixed relatively freely until the 1880s, when state legislatures passed the first laws requiring railroads to provide separate cars for Negro or colored passengers. Buses weren't invented at this point. Florida became the first state to mandate segregated railroad cars in 1887, followed by Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, and other states by the end of the 19th century. Members of the black community in New Orleans decided to mount resistance after the Louisiana Separate Car Act of 1890 was passed. At the heart of the case became Plessy versus Ferguson, and that was a law passed in Louisiana in 1890, providing for separate railway carriages for the white and colored races. It stipulated that all passenger railways had to provide these separate cars, which should be equal in facilities. Often they weren't. Often they were run down, not kept up well, while the white cars were in good shape. This is a car. It may not be a car from Louisiana, but it's a railroad car from those days. Homer Adolph Plessy agreed to be the plaintiff in the case aimed at testing the law's constitutionality. He was of mixed race. He described himself as 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African American, African blood. On June 7, 1892, Plessy bought a ticket on a train from New Orleans bound for Covington, Louisiana, and took a vacant seat in a whites-only car. After refusing to leave the car at the conductor's insistence, he was arrested and jailed. In Montgomery, Alabama, back in 1955, you had 4 women who faced the same problem with Rosa Parks being the most famous of all of them. Convicted by a New Orleans court of violating the 1890 law, Plessy filed a petition against the presiding judge, John H. Ferguson, claiming that the law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Over the next few years, segregation and black disenfranchisement picked up pace in the South and was more tolerated by the North. Congress defeated a bill that would have given federal protection to elections in 1892 and nullified a number of Reconstruction laws on the books. Well, this is Justice Henry Brown. He's from Harvard. He's a law school graduate from Harvard University. And he would write the decision that would go down in history. On May 18th, 1896, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict in Plessy versus Ferguson. In declaring separate but equal facilities constitutional on interstate railroads, the court ruled that the protections of the 14th Amendment applied only to political and civil rights like voting and jury service. and not social rights, sitting in the railroad car of your choice. But of course, when the Constitution was written, nobody thought of these things like separate railroad cars. They just didn't do it. And these guys are interpreting what these guys, who might have been drunk while they were writing the Constitution, or might have been doing this, this, and this, all of a sudden they're constitutional experts. Even though they don't know what really happened at this point would be 110 years earlier. The court denied that segregated railroad cars for black people were necessarily inferior. We consider the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument, Justice Henry Brown wrote, to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. Rejecting Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights were violated, the Supreme Court ruled that a law that implies merely a legal distinction between white and black people was not unconstitutional. As a result, restrictive Jim Crow legislation and separate public accommodations based on race became commonplace. This continued in New York till 1963. How many of you went to Penn Station? In Penn Station, there were separate water fountains. One for whites, one for colored. 1963. All legal. You know, this Harvard guy who knew everything decided, yeah, you know what, it's okay. It's okay. Why don't we do it? Let's separate the races. This is Justice John Marshall Harlan. He dissented. He was a former slave holder from Kentucky. He had opposed emancipation and civil rights for freed slaves during the Reconstruction era, but changed his position due to his outrage over the action of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Harlan argued in his dissent that segregation ran counter to the constitutional principle of equality under the law. The arbitrary separation of citizens on the basis of race while they are on a public highway is a badge of servitude wholly inconsistent with the civil freedom and equality before the law established by the Constitution. It cannot be justified upon any legal grounds. Well, there's more. This is all about Cummings versus the Board of Education. There were other lawsuits. This is 1899, that Cummings versus the Board of Education's, the plaintiffs said, hey, wait a minute, there is separate education in public school. But we as blacks are not, or colored people, are not getting the same educational opportunities as the whites. It goes to the Supreme Court, 1899, and well, the court said, no, it's okay, it's okay. Segregated public schools did not violate the Constitution. The Plessy versus Ferguson verdict enshrined the doctrine of separate but equal as a constitutional justification for segregation, ensuring the survival of the Jim Crow South. Interstate railroads were among many segregated public facilities the verdict sanctioned. Other areas included eventually buses, hotels, theaters, swimming pools, and schools. In fact, in Biloxi, Mississippi, I was there in 2003, a friend of mine said, let's walk around Biloxi, I want to show you something. And what he showed me was a plaque. And the plaque said that it was illegal for African Americans to swim in the Gulf of Mexico near Biloxi, Mississippi until 1968. The Gulf of Mexico, it's water. It's an international water. But according to Mississippi law, no African American could swim in the Gulf of Mexico in Biloxi until 1968. So Theodore Roosevelt, racist? Did he believe in eugenics? Did he believe in bad genes? On September 14, 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th President of the United States, following the assassination of the President William McKinley. Roosevelt had been Vice President for only 194 days when he became the President. He did not see black Americans as equals. He believed that black men made poor soldiers, and he put down their efforts, or the efforts of Buffalo soldiers who fought alongside his men at San Juan Hill in Cuba during the Spanish-American War in 1898, falsely claiming that they
I'm taking her out right now.
falsely claiming that they ran away under fire. Negro troops were shirkers in their duties and would only go as far as they were led by white officers. But, on the other hand, this is one of the first in the White House, he invites Booker T. Washington to the White House shortly after he became the President of the United States on October 16, 1901, even though he thought that African American citizens were inferior to him. But also, while he was the governor of New York, a distinguished colored singer was denied in Albany, New York, in one of the hotels. The circumstance, having reached Roosevelt, he went in person and invited the citizen to have residence where he gave him lodging. When he assumed the office of Vice President, his first act was to appoint a colored man as an executive messenger against the protest of certain officials. He was the first president to entertain a colored man, Booker T. Washington, but after criticism of that visit, Roosevelt never invited another African American to the White House again. So what was he? Was he a racist? Did he believe in eugenics? Did he believe that his genes were better than a black man's genes or other genes? Well, Roosevelt's racial philosophy of white superiority dovetailed his support of the eugenics movement, which advocated selective breeding to engineer a race of people with more desirable characteristics and the sterilization of less desirable people, such as criminals, people with developmental disabilities, and for some, people of color. So what was he? He did invite Booker T. Washington to the White House. He did act when the colored singer, while he was governor in New York, couldn't find lodging in Albany, New York. He took care of him. So what was he? He shared similar views on race with prominent figures as Alexander Graham Bell, prominent figures at the time, the inventor of the telephone, John D. Rockefeller, the richest person in the world, Winston Churchill, he was a young politician at that time. All of them supported the eugenics movement. Roosevelt's approach to racial issues was to proceed slowly toward the goal of social and economic equality. He cautioned against imposing radical changes in government policy, favoring hopefully gradual adjustments in the attitudes of white Americans toward ethnic minorities. Lynching was an event. These people came out to watch a lynching. Look at the crowd. Look at the crowd. That's a big crowd. And what are they doing? They're watching somebody get strung up and hanging from a pole. During the 1880s and 1890s, instances of lethal mob violence increased steadily, peaking in 1899 when 27 Georgians fell victim to lynch mobs. Between 1890 and 1900, Georgia averaged more than one mob killing a month. Georgia was not the only state where lynchings occur. Mississippi was the nation's top spot for lynchings. Lynching victims were murdered by being hanged, shot, burned, drowned, dismembered, or dragged to the ground. In May 1905, a storekeeper by the name of F.M. Holbrook and his wife were murdered in Onset County, Georgia. In the aftermath, one white man and 3 African-American men were arrested. while the white man was accused of the murder and the 3 African-American men were accused of being accomplices to the murder. They were held in jail in Annecy County along with 6 others, all African-American men, for various reasons. Mob lynches 7 in white men, Watkinsville, that's also in Georgia. At midnight on June 29th, a large mob of individuals, reportedly from nearby Morgan County, Georgia, organized and traveled to Annecy County at 2 a.m. on June 30th, 1905. The large mob, between approximately 50 and 100 people, broke into the Annecy County Jail. 8 lynched by the mob. How did these people break into the jail? Who's watching the jail? Unless it was an inside job. The mob went to the house of the town marshal and compelled him to take them to the county jail, where the jailer relinquished the keys to the jail cells at gunpoint. Afterwards, they seized 9 of 10 prisoners, including the murder suspect, proceeded to tie them up to nearby fence posts. One prisoner had apparently avoided the attention of the mob and was left in his cell. Of the 9 men seized by the mob, only 1 had been convicted of a crime, while the others were awaiting trial. After tying the men to the post, they proceeded to open fire on the men, with the New York Tribune reporting that 5 volleys, 5 gunshots, or 5 rounds of gunshots, were fired at the men. 8 of the men died as a result of the gunfire, while 1 man survived and proceeded to play dead. Following the lynching, several of the bodies were burned in the same grave. Very few people were ever arrested following a lynching. Why? Because the cops were in on it. The cops were in on it. They knew everything that was going on. So that leads W.E.B. Du Bois to action. And he's going to start a movement. Oddly enough, he starts the movement in Canada, not in the United States, across the Peace River. He drafted a call to select a few people. The call had 2 purposes: organized determination and aggressive action on the part of men who believed in Negro freedom and growth, in opposition to present methods of strangling honest criticism. Du Bois gathered a group of men representing every region of the country except the West. They had hoped to meet in Buffalo, New York, when refused accommodation, and there are 2 stories about this. One is the hotel was filled. The other is they wouldn't rent to African or colored men at that time. Nobody seems to know exactly what happened there. But anyway, they went across the border to Canada, to Ontario. 29 men met at the Erie Beach Hotel in Ontario, Niagara Falls, Ontario, which is more fun than the American side. The Canadian side has a lot more to do, actually. I don't think they were worried about that then. From July 11th through 14th, 1905. And this is the group of men trying to figure something out. The Niagarites adopted a constitution and bylaws, established committees, and wrote a Declaration of Principles outlining the future for African Americans. After 3 days, they returned across the border with a renewed sense of resolve in the struggle for freedom and equality. At their initial meeting, the founding members of the Niagara movement adopted a constitution and bylaws and drafted a Declaration of Principles that dedicated the group to fighting for political and social equality for African Americans. Well, Theodore Roosevelt won rather easily re-election in 1904. He was a very popular president. After all, he settled labor disputes. He somehow got Panama pulled away from Colombia so he could start, or at least in his mind, start the construction of the Panama Canal. And the United States is a growing power. They have Philippines right now. They have Puerto Rico, and they have Guam. So they have possessions, and Hawaii. So they're a growing country, and they have more influence overseas. But he also has an immigration problem. Well, something of an immigration problem. The American presidential election was held on November 8th, 1904, and the Republican incumbent Theodore Roosevelt soundly defeated the Democrat Alton B. Parker. I guarantee you, nobody in here has ever heard of Alton B. Parker, have they? No. Roosevelt's win marked the first time that a president, not originally elected to office, succeeded in retaining the presidency. That would be John Tyler. That would also be Andrew Johnson and Chester A. Arthur. Those three that didn't get the presidency. On election day, Roosevelt achieved a landslide victory, 336 electoral votes, 140 for Parker. He got 59% of the vote.
Wow.
Parker got 37.6%, and the socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs got 400,000 votes. Now, what did he run on? Well, he ran on good relations with the world. But relations among Americans were more important, except he had the problem with Jim Crow. He admitted that the Founding Fathers could not have foreseen certain problems that plagued the nation, but he told people those problems are solvable. They're really solvable. And also great nations have problems. He recognized the industrial age. Remember, the United States is flipping. There's electricity. There are cars, there are trains, there are things available to people that were not available before, like lights in the street lights, and indoor plumbing for a select few. So things are changing. But he assumed that Americans, or he told Americans, that technology innovations brought tremendous change in American life. What do you think? Those changes brought tremendous, or those changes brought tremendous changes to American life? They did. You had movies. Go to the movies that year. Speak softly. Carry a big stick. In his annual messages to Congress in 1904 and 1905, Theodore Roosevelt expanded the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically said, if a European country came to North America, or even South America, started the war, America is going to back up whatever that country is, in either North or South America. Roosevelt stated that not only were the nations in the Western Hemisphere not open to colonization by European powers, but the United States had the responsibility to preserve order and protect life and property in those countries. European intervention in Latin America resurfaced as an issue in the United States foreign policy when European governments began to use force to pressure several Latin American countries to repay their debts. Britain, Germany, and Italian gunboats blockaded Venezuelan ports in 1902 when the Venezuelan government defaulted on its debt to foreign bond holders. Many Americans worried that Europeans' intervention in Latin America would undermine their country's traditional dominance in the region. Roosevelt tied his policy to the Monroe Doctrine and was consistent with his foreign policy of walk softly but carry a big stick. He stated, keeping with the Monroe Doctrine, which was from 1823, that the United States was justified in exercising international police power to put an end to chronic unrest or wrongdoing in the Western Hemisphere. And that is James Monroe, a drawing of James Monroe back in 1823 when he announced this policy. Monroe made 4 basic points. The United States would not interfere with European affairs. The United States recognized and would not interfere with existing colonies in the Americas. The Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization. If a European power tried to interfere with any nation in the Americas, it would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. So what was American life like? Where'd you work? You worked on the farm. You worked in sweatshops as well. That is a sweatshop. People working long hours for very little money in unsafe conditions. The mass migration of people into the cities from farms enriched some people but caused severe problems for others. Some of your grandparents may have faced these conditions. Jobs in factories were considered better than domestic service. And department store jobs were considered even better than factory jobs. Now, you might think of the department stores of those days as S. Klein's or Gertz or Orbach's. They weren't like that. They weren't like that at all. They were just little stores that sold some stuff. Clerical work was open to most women. Well, you could be a secretary. It was considered more prestigious than some other jobs. African Americans had limited opportunities and most worked in labor or service jobs. Many immigrants. I don't know when my grandfather really came over. I can't find the records. But I know my grandmother was born in 1909. I think it was 1906 in Prague. She got married when she was 23 in 1929. One of my grandparents was born in the United States around 1902, 1903, and the other was born in Russia in 1900 and came over. So the only one who probably faced all of this was my grandmother's family, the Stillers, as in Jerry Stiller and Ben Stiller. That's my relatives. Anyway, many immigrants face resentment and low wages, and I'm not sure you know this, but a third of the immigrants went home. A third of the immigrants went home. Thousands of immigrants crowded into cities seeking a better life. Less than 8% of American homes had electricity. Most American women could not vote, and it seemed women's suffragist movement died. Susan B. Anthony is rather ill at this point. Elizabeth Cody Stanton, she's dead. She died in 1902, and there's really nobody to pick up the torch looking for the vote for women. The rapid, unregulated urbanization led to overcrowding and substandard housing. Cities lacked adequate infrastructure, including water and sewage systems. Tenements were cheap. Low-rise apartment buildings that were often cramped, poorly lit, and lacked indoor plumbing and proper ventilation. The lack of clean water and inadequate sanitation made workers and their families vulnerable to infectious diseases like tuberculosis. That was going on down there. And that's the Lower East Side. This happens to be on Christmas Day, this picture. But take a look at that. Take a look at how many people are crowded into that street, 1905. For many of the urban poor, and most people living in the cities were poor, living in the city resulted in a decrease in the quality of life. With few city services to rely upon, the working class lived daily with overcrowding, inadequate water facilities, unpaved roads, and disease. And there were horses on the road, and hopefully what they left behind was cleaned up. That wasn't a guarantee. Working class wages provided little more than substantive living and few, if any, opportunities for movement outside of the city slums. I don't know how many of you had 8-year-old boys. I had one. I have all girls as grandkids. But how would you like your 8-year-old son, grandson, maybe great-grandson to work in the mines? Do you want that? You want your 8-year-old kid working in the mines?
No.
Well, there was an estimated 2 million children under the age of 16 working around the United States. Children varied in age from 6 and 7 in the cotton mills of Georgia, and 8, 9, and 10 years old in the coal breakers of Pennsylvania, to 14, 15, 16-year-olds in other states. In Alabama, a law stated that a child under 16 years of age could not work in the cotton mill at night longer than 8 hours. North and South Carolina and Georgia had no restriction upon the work of children at night. In New Jersey, boys and girls after the age of 14 could work all night long. In North Carolina, a bill was proposed to raise the minimum working age for children from 12 to 14 and prohibited night work for children under 14. However, the Cotton Manufacturers Association president declared that if a minimum age law passed specifying 14 as the minimum age, every mill in the state would shut down. After an organized campaign of opposition, the measure failed to receive a single vote in the North Carolina legislature. American life, though, if you had money, like, you know, a Vanderbilt or Stanford White or Rockefeller, it was great. You had electricity. You had indoor plumbing. And that is Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, in 1905.
Wow.
Does it look familiar?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some, you know, well, the bridge is there. That's the Williamsburg Bridge, and that is the, no, this would be the Brooklyn Bridge, and that would be the Williamsburg Bridge. Brooklyn Bridge and the Williamsburg Bridge. For the emerging middle class, and there was a middle class. It wasn't very big, but there was a middle class in 1905, benefiting from growing incomes, increases in leisure time. The expanding city offered many advantages. There were department stores, there were chain stores, there were shopping centers, and they were put together because the middle class wanted to buy material. Parks, amusement parks, baseball stadiums were built to meet aesthetic and recreational needs. Transportation systems improved, as did the general infrastructure. Better meeting increased needs of the middle and upper class of city dwellers. City life. This was your grocery store. The guy had all the stock there. You walked in, you told him what you wanted. That was how you shopped back in those days. The literacy rate, 106.6 literate people per 1,000, which meant that there were, what, 893 illiterates out of every 1,000. Now, what's illiterate? Probably non-educated. There was a study that showed that 6,180,063 people were illiterate in the United States. The Arizona Republic, Arizona is not a state at this point, has very few people, about 158,000 people. Observe, literacy is more common in the country than in the city. This is due to the superior schools in town and the more illiteracy. I'm illiterate. Illiteracy is more common in the country than in the city. This is due to the superior schools in towns and more general attendance of children. Arizona, not the state, 158,000 people living in the Arizona territory. There were about 84 million people in the United States. There were 45 states. America had territories in Alaska, Arizona, Guam, Hawaii, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Philippines, and Puerto Rico. But Theodore Roosevelt wanted to make America a superpower, diplomatically. And how does he do that? Well, he's going to get involved in the Russian-Japanese War and try to be the peacemaker. That is what he's going to do. And if he succeeds, America becomes a superpower. And here it is, the Russo-Japanese War, which started in 1904. The Russian Empire was ruled by Nicholas II, and it was one of the largest territories in the world. But there was the Siberian shipping center of Vladivostok. It was closed most of the year because it's in Siberia. It was only open a few months a year. So the empire is in need of a warm water port in the Pacific Ocean for purposes of trade, and they also want to build a navy. Tsar Nicholas II set his sights on the Korean Peninsula and the Liaodong Peninsula. The Japanese were concerned about Russia's influence in the region since the first Sino-China-Japanese War of 1895. Well, Japan decided, let's go to war, staging a surprise attack on the Russian Navy at Port Arthur, February 8th, 1904. The military costs were high for both countries, mass casualties. The Japanese asked President Roosevelt to negotiate a peace agreement, and representatives of the two nations met in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. For the sake of maintaining the balance of power and equal economic opportunity in the region, Roosevelt preferred that the war end on terms that left both Russia and Japan a role to play in northeast China. Though excited by the Japanese military victories, Roosevelt worried about the consequences to American interests if Japan managed to drive Russia out entirely. And these are the negotiations taking place in New Hampshire. Because neither nation was in a strong enough financial position to continue the war easily, both were forced to compromise in terms of peace. The Roosevelt Initiative Treaty, or initiated a treaty, ultimately gave Japan control of Korea and most of South Manchuria, including Port Arthur and the railway that connected it with the rest of the region, along with the southern half of the Sakhalin Island. Russia's power was curtailed in the region, but it was not required to pay Japan's war costs. The Japanese public felt that they had won the war, but they considered the lack of indemnity to be an affront. They wanted money. The Russian people, equally upset about giving up half of the Sakhalin Islands. The actual importance of Roosevelt's mediation and personal pressure on the leadership in Moscow and Tokyo to the final agreement is unclear, but the war ended. Russia was an absolute miserable place, which is why my relatives decided to get out of there. Because there might have been a pogrom coming after that. It was an absolutely miserable place. People who wanted to practice religion couldn't, and the Tsar was the Tsar. And you know, there are many jokes that I've heard over the years from family members about the Tsar and how they hated the Tsar. The Russian Revolution of 1905 is also known as the First Russian Revolution. Starts on January 22nd. A wave of mass political and social unrest then began to spread across the vast areas of the Russian Empire. The unrest was primarily directed at the Tsar, Nicholas II, the nobility, and the ruling class. It included worker strikes, peasant unrest, and military mutinies. On January 9th, they were still going by the Julian calendar there. They weren't going by today's calendar. January 22nd, violence erupted in St. Petersburg, Russia, when unarmed demonstrators led by Father Georgy Gapon were fired upon by soldiers of the Imperial Guard as they marched toward the Winter Palace to present a petition to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. The events in St. Petersburg, what was referred to as Bloody Sunday, provoked public outrage. It was an absolute miserable place. This is a drawing of St. Petersburg. Newly emancipated peasants earned too little and were not allowed to sell or mortgage their allotted land. Ethnic and national minorities resented the policy of Russification of the empire. This was caused by discrimination and repression against national minorities, particularly Jews and also Poles. It included bans on voting, serving in the Imperial Guard or Navy, and limiting their attendance in schools. Soldiers returning from a bloody and disgraceful defeat, where Japan found inadequate factory pay, shortages, general disarray, and organized in protest. Nicholas II attempted to appease the people with a Duma. However, the autocracy eventually resorted to brute force near the end of the year in order to curtail the burgeoning strike movement that continued to spread. The Tsar had been seen as the champion of the people, not all the people, but had changed. That had changed after Bloody Sunday. So I'm in a group that doesn't watch football. I'm in the group that absolutely doesn't watch football. That's okay, because football was almost banned by Theodore Roosevelt. And it is an interesting story, but of course the first question you need to ask is,
Why?
how could he ban it?
And why?
How? Well, I'm going to tell you why. How could he ban it? He doesn't have that power. Here's the problem. Theodore Roosevelt threatened to ban football in America unless rules were implemented to make the game safer after a reported 40 players died from injuries suffered on the field over a 2-year period in 1904 and 1905. There's the why. I believe in outdoor games, and I do not mind in the least that they are rough games, or that those who take part in them are occasionally injured. But banning the game was absolutely brutal. Absolutely brutal. There were no rules, literally no rules. You can pick up a guy and throw him for a first down. You can literally do that. The November 1905 death of Union College halfback Harold Moore, who died of a cerebral hemorrhage after being kicked in the head while trying to tackle a New York University player. NYU doesn't have any sports, by the way, major sports. Became a major newspaper story. A cartoon in the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune showed the Grim Reaper atop a goalpost. Theodore Roosevelt brought the presidents of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton into the Oval Office and told them fix the game or else. Now, Harvard, Charles Eliot, he's the president of Harvard. Theodore Roosevelt, Harvard alum, absolutely hates Charles Eliot. They hate each other. H-A-T-E, hate, hate, hate. They absolutely hate each other. The Harvard, they just hated each other over the years. The Harvard contingent wanted to change football. Walter Camp, who wrote the rules of football in 1876, and Yale wanted to keep as is. This is a cartoon from that time in the newspaper, when cartoons were big in newspapers editorially. And it's a football player hiking a football, which looks like a watermelon, because that's what the size was. It's got a death shawl around him. It's skull and crossbones. Back there are littered bodies of dead football players, and on here it says death. The 12th man on the 11-man football field. Death. No one actually could figure out how Roosevelt could end the game because just the threat of it, but just the ban of the threat was enough to get people's attention, and playing rules would be changed. The Roosevelt Initiative would lead to the formation of the National Collegiate Athletic Association. And that's football action 1904 in college. It's a packed crowd watching that game. Columbia, Duke, and Northwestern suspended their football programs. The Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, said that he would make an example of any West Point cadet who plays rough football and have him dismissed immediately if necessary. Well, there's Charles Eliot. Charles Eliot is the mortal enemy of Theodore Roosevelt, and he wants to get rid of football. And remember Groucho Marx in the movie, which one? It's Horse Feathers. Whatever it is, I'm against it. Whatever it is, I'm against it. Well, Charles Eliot. According to the New York Times, Harvard President Charles Eliot said that football was more brutalizing than prize fighting, cockfighting, or bullfighting. I demand that football changes its rules or be abolished. Change the game or forsake it, said Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. suffered major injuries in high school and college playing football. But there was another part of Roosevelt. Not only did he hate Charles Eliot, but he had a soft spot in his heart for these guys, the Rough Riders. And this would come into play with Roosevelt in the band. 10 of the Rough Riders, the soldiers who fought with him in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, gave their occupations as football players when they enlisted in 1898. The college presidents needed a solution, and they began to work on that solution. John J. McGraw, I could put the picture of Pete Rose here. I could put the picture of Pete Rose here, and it's the same story. It's the exact same story. John J. McGraw and the World Series betting scandal. The manager of the New York Giants, John J. McGraw, wins $400, about $14,000, betting on his team to win the World Series. That would be against Philadelphia. McGraw had held his team out of the 1904 series against Boston because of a grudge against the American League president, Van Johnson, who suspended McGraw for his boorish and on-field behavior during McGraw's tenure as an American League manager in Baltimore in 1901. Led by Christy Mathewson's 3 shutouts thrown in the span of 6 days. He's pitching every other day. Today, you can't throw more than 80 pitches, and you can't face batters more than twice because analytics taking over the game. Anyway, beat the Philadelphia A's in 5 games. McGraw got his money and his revenge on Johnson. There were rumors that gamblers had gotten to Philadelphia's star pitcher, Rube Waddell, paid him to snap the World Series. Waddell pitched but performed poorly because of a shoulder injury. McGraw won the bet and let the public know about it. Pete Rose didn't tell you that, he didn't say he was betting. He always denied he was betting, even though people knew he was betting. He was not thrown out of baseball for betting. You want to go to the movies? It's a Nickelodeon. That is a Nickelodeon. And you could go see a movie. Now, I don't know why you'd want to see a movie. They'd be no more than 9 minutes long in the dingy theater, and had no sound. But people went to see the movies. They went to see the movies. May 28th, the Warner Brothers, Harry, Sam, and Albert, opened the Cascade Movie Palace in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Seated 99 people, and there's a reason for that. And the patron could view 3 movies for a nickel, which would be about $1.79 today. The Warners kept the capacity under 99 seats to avoid safety regulations, such as fire extinguishers and having emergency exits. Please do not spit on the floor. This is from a 1937 Warner Brothers cartoon. It was an inside joke. It was an inside joke. This is where everybody's sitting here like this, and you're following the bouncing ball. She was an acrobat store, the blah, blah, blah. Please do not spit on the floor. It's an inside joke, and here's why. Before the film, Sam Warner opened the show with some informative slides for the audience. The first stated, please read the titles, to yourself. Loud reading annoys your neighbors. This was followed by, ladies, kindly remove your hats. And gentlemen, please do not spit on the floor. When the first reel of the film ended, a slide appeared reading, 1 moment please, while the operator changes reels. So they threw that in as a joke in the cartoon in 1937. On June 19th, Harry Davis and John Harris opened their first movie theater, dubbing it a Nickelodeon. Pittsburgh, that's without an H, Pittsburgh. That's without an H, because that's how it was spelled. Pittsburgh got back its H in 1909. The some American Standards Committee said every town that had Burg at the end of its name, B-U-R-G, could not have an H. Except the Pittsburgh people said, hey, we were incorporated as Pittsburgh with an H. In 1909, they got their H back. The opening feature was the 1903 film, The Great Train Robbery. The name Nickelodeon was derived from the cost of admission, a nickel, $1.79 today, and the Greek word theater, Odeon. And you got to see a movie like this. How many of you used to watch Lassie on TV? Right? Yeah. Well, it's Lassie, except the dog's called Rover. Rescued by Rover was a shepherd dog who leads its master to a kidnapped baby. The film featured creative cutting and energetic traveling shots to make it more suspenseful. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, it was also the least expensive movie to produce at $37.40 or $1,340 today. It was a 7-minute movie that was so successful that the film wore out, and they had to shoot it again because the film wore out. Sherlock Holmes is back. He wasn't supposed to be back, but Sherlock Holmes is back. How many of you read Sherlock Holmes books? Yeah. Yeah, you like that. They go back a long time. A Study in Scarlet, 1887, was the first in the series of Sherlock Holmes books by Arthur Conan Doyle. The fictional detective Sherlock Holmes was highly lucrative for Conan Doyle, but the author decided to kill him off once he had earned enough money, sending him over a Swiss waterfall in 1893. See, Arthur Conan Doyle wanted to be considered a serious writer, and he thought Sherlock Holmes was not serious literature. Too commercial. I want to be a serious guy, like Van Gogh, who never sold a painting in his life. But Holmes returned because his publisher, his family, and everyday people wanted Holmes to return, and the author listened to his fans. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, a 9-minute silent film in America, produced by the Vitagraph Company, was released on September 6th. Another movie, Sherlock Holmes, or Held for Ransom, was released on October the 7th. Viva Las Vegas! This is where Las Vegas starts, right here. And it didn't start because of casinos. It started because it had a little water, and there was a railroad around. May 15th, Las Vegas officially was founded as a city. 110 acres of land were auctioned to buyers. The land was sold to establish a railroad stop between Los Angeles, California and Salt Lake City, Utah. The completion of the San Pedro, Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad made Las Vegas a refueling and rest stop. San Pedro is the cruise ship port for Los Angeles. It's where all the cruise ships go out of. The availability of water made Las Vegas an ideal refueling point and rest stop. Well, the 1905 legacy. You made it this far, so let's go back and take a look at what happened in 1905 and the resulting actions from 1905. The Niagara movement never gained traction. Activists were fed up in 1908 after a Springfield, Illinois race riot and decided to act. Less than a month prior to William Howard Taft's inaugural, on February 12, 1909, the date of Abraham Lincoln's 100th birthday, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was established in New York by an interracial group of activists. Child labor. The federal child labor provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 were enacted to ensure that when young people work, the work is safe and does not jeopardize their health, well-being, or educational opportunities. It's law, right? It's a law. However, this year, 2004, at least 16 states had one or more bills that elected officials were considering that would weaken child labor laws. And at least 13 states were seeking to strengthen them. Indiana repealed all work hour restrictions for 16 and 17-year-olds who previously couldn't work past 10 o'clock at night or before 6 a.m. on school days. The law also extended legal work hours for 14 and 15-year-olds. Russia, that's me in St. Petersburg. I'm actually in the Winter Palace in that show. Theodore Roosevelt won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1906 because of his work in ending the Russian-Japanese War. In Russia, Nicholas II would be overthrown in 1917. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks would be part of two revolutions that year. Lenin would ultimately prevail in Russia. Soviet Union collapsed on December 26, 1991. Now, if you think the Russian-Japanese War is over or World War II is over, think again. It's not. Japanese relations with Russia improved in the wake of the treaty. The United States and Japan's relationship worsened on December 11, 1941. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II. The Americans and Russians were allies. The Soviet Union and Japan never signed the peace treaty. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Russia decided to do something about the Kuril Islands dispute, also known as the Northern Territories in Japan. Japan has claimed that the Soviet Union, now Russia, illegally seized the four islands after it surrendered to the Americans September 2nd, 1945. In March of 2022, the Russian military started a military exercise involving more than 3,000 troops on the chain of islands. Neither side has signed a peace treaty because of this dispute. That's me here, my friend Bruce Morton, who's in Denver now, and Joe Namath. The college football presidents did come up with a plan to make football safer. The United States is the king of professional sports rather the National Football League is the king of the sports in the United States. College football has a substantial following. According to self-proclaimed experts, Jerry Jones' Dallas Cowboys franchise could be worth as much as $11 billion. And the lowest valued franchise, the Cincinnati Bengals, is worth more than $5 billion. But, of course, the only worth it is somebody willing to pay for the business. Players are still dying on the field from football-related activities. Head injuries remain a problem. 11 young players this year, since July, have died on the football field.
This year?
11, this year, 2024. That is John J. McGraw with an umpire and somebody from the Philadelphia Athletics in 1905. The baseball Giants owner Charles Stoneham and his manager John McGraw co-owned a racetrack and a casino in Cuba. Well, Pete Rose never went that far. He probably went to casinos. McGraw's business interests included a Manhattan pool hall that he co-owned with Arnold Rothstein. Do you know who Arnold Rothstein is?
Yeah, big.
Yeah, he is the guy who put the word organized in organized crime. He was an absolute mathematical genius during the Depression, not the Depression, during Prohibition. He had a series of vessels delivering booze from Europe to America, to New York. Nobody ever touched him. He was killed during a card game, and as he was dying, a police officer said, "Who done it?" He said, "My mother did it." You know, he had to be true to his profession. Anyway, Rothstein, he denied having any involvement in the fixing of the 1919 World Series between the Chicago White Sox and the Cincinnati Reds.
Yeah.
8 White Sox players were banned from baseball. Rothstein allegedly earned around $350,000, $6.4 million today's money, by betting on the Cincinnati Reds. In 1989, Cincinnati Reds manager Pete Rose was tossed from baseball for doing what McGraw did, bet on his team. In 2024, Tucupita Marcano was banned from baseball for life for betting on baseball. Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote 4 novels and 56 short stories about the mastermind's pursuit of criminals using his observational skills and power of deduction. Sherlock Holmes stories have been adapted for stage, film, television. Benedict Cumberbatch, Peter Cushing, Roger Moore, Ian Kellen, Michael Caine, Charlton Heston, Jonathan Pryce have played the detective. Basil Rathbone played Holmes in 14 movies. Sherlock Holmes' popularity today is extended into video games. Las Vegas. Las Vegas was a driving force in the creation of Clark County in Nevada in 1909. The city was incorporated in 1911 as part of the county. Nevada decided to legalize gambling in 1931, but only in certain areas and under strict conditions. This was a turning point in Las Vegas history as it would begin its ascension to earn the title of gambling capital of the world. The 1930s were a booming time for Las Vegas. More and more hotels and casinos were being built. Bugsy Siegel and other mafiosos ended up there opening casinos. The wise guys were being built, and the city began to establish itself as a destination for entertainment and gambling. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? It is your turn to talk.
Oh, boy.
Anybody have anything to say?